Imagine this. You sell a parcel of barren land that has been gathering dust in the family records for decades. You get $50,000, money that could save your family from debt. And suddenly a year later, you're driving by and you see drilling rigs. Underneath those rocks was $2 million worth of oil. And someone knew that when they offered you a measly $50,000. This isn't just a bad deal, it's a story of betrayal, deceit, and ruined fortunes. Today we tell you the shocking story of John and Marge Carter of Texas, who lost millions over a single signature. The story begins in the small town of Pecos, lost among the dusty plains of West Texas, a place where everyone knows each other, where people live a simple life. John Carter, a mechanic with calloused hands and an open smile, has been working at the local gas station Bill's for 15 years. Every morning at 6:30, he puts on his tattered overalls with his name embroidered on them and sets out to fix the cars of the locals, many of whom he has known since childhood. His wife, Marge, is an English teacher at Pecos Middle School. Children adore her for her warmth and patience, and parents respect her for her dedication to her profession, despite her modest salary. The Carters have 2 children. 17-year-old daughter Emma, the pride of the family, an excellent student who dreams of going to college and becoming the first in the family to get a higher education, and 14-year-old son Mike just started high school, passionate about soccer and auto mechanics like his father. Life wasn't easy. They had to make every dollar count, but they made it through, supporting each other and keeping faith in a better future. In 2008, the economic crisis hit America, and the oil town of Pecos felt it the hardest. Gas prices skyrocketed, then plummeted, and oil companies began laying off workers. The Carters, like thousands of other families, found themselves in financial trouble. The school district cut its budget by 15%, and Marge's paycheck dropped by $200 a month, an amount critical to their family budget. Bill's gas station was struggling to stay afloat. People were driving less, repairing old cars instead of buying new ones, and John's job was cut in half. By 2012, the family's financial situation was critical. They had accumulated $27,000 in debt, credit cards with relentless interest, medical bills after Mike's unexpected appendectomy, late payments on the house. Emma was preparing for college. She'd been accepted to the University of Texas, but there was no money for college, not even for her first semester. The dream she had worked towards all her high school years was crumbling before her eyes, and Marge couldn't watch her daughter cry quietly at night, thinking her parents couldn't hear. The family had one asset, 40 acres of land about an hour west of Pecos, near the New Mexico border. John inherited the land from his grandfather Frank in 2005. Old Frank had bought the land for next to nothing in the 1960s, hoping to build a ranch there one day, but his dream never materialized. The land was considered virtually worthless, a rocky parcel with concrete-hard soil where even the toughest Texas grass had trouble growing. Neighboring parcels had also been vacant for years, or used as meager pasture for cattle. The Carters faithfully paid the taxes on this land, about $600 a year, which was noticeable in their budget. John had tried to sell the land several times, even placing advertisements in the local newspaper and on the supermarket bulletin board, but there were no takers. Who needs rocks in the middle of the desert? They never seriously considered that this dusty piece of land could be their salvation. It was often the subject of jokes at family dinners.
"Our family treasure is a mountain of rocks,"
John would say, and everyone would laugh. On a chilly March morning in 2012, as John was changing the oil in the county sheriff's old Ford, a stranger walked into the machine shop. He stood out among the locals like a diamond among pebbles. A tall, trim man in his 50s wearing an immaculately fitting suit that clearly cost more than John made in a month. The stranger introduced himself as Richard Blake, a representative of Texas Prime Properties, a real estate and land company operating throughout West Texas. His voice was confident, every word measured.
"Mr. Carter, I've heard about your property west of town. We are exploring expansion opportunities in the area and are interested in purchasing your property,"
Blake said, holding out a business card with a gold-embossed logo. John grinned in disbelief and wiped his hands with a cloth.
"Why would anyone want these rocks? There's not even grass growing out there."
Blake smiled.
"We have technology to improve the soil. We're planning to expand pastures for a neighboring ranch. Nothing special, just a good place for our strategy."
Blake then mentioned a figure that made John's jaw drop. $50,000 in cash, a sum that seemed incredible to the Carters, almost unrealistic for a place they themselves considered worthless. John stared at Blake, trying to figure out if this was a joke. $50,000. The Carters could pay off all their debts and send their daughter to college with that. At home, John excitedly told Marge about the unexpected proposal. Marge, always the more cautious and practical of the two, looked at the news with suspicion.
50,000 for this lot? There's something wrong here, John. Nobody pays that kind of money for useless land. Maybe we should go to a surveyor or the land commission. See if there's something we don't know about. Find out what the real value is.
But when John called Blake back to discuss the details, the businessman's tone immediately changed.
Mr. Carter, I appreciate your discretion, but we're on a tight schedule. A neighboring ranch is waiting for pasture expansion in time for the summer season. If a deal isn't done within a week, we'll be forced to consider other options.
Then came the words that sealed the Carters' fate.
$50,000 now or nothing. I'm leaving for Dallas tomorrow for 2 weeks. Make up your mind.
After an agonizing night of weighing the pros and cons, looking at a pile of unpaid bills and Emma's acceptance letter from the university, they decided to take their chances. At 10 a.m. on the 17th of April, 2012, John and Marge walked into the gleaming offices of Texas Prime Properties in Pecos's only high-rise. Blake greeted them with a polished smile and cups of coffee from an expensive coffee shop. Documents were waiting on the polished mahogany desk. John signed the papers with a trembling hand, and then Blake ceremoniously handed them a certified bank check for $50,000. As she accepted the check, Marge couldn't contain her emotions. Tears streamed down her face, tears of relief and hope. Now Emma could go to the college she had dreamed of all her life. They could pay off the debts that kept them awake at night. For the first time in years, the future didn't seem so bleak. It had been 8 months since the land sale. The Carters' lives were finally settling down after years of financial struggle. Emma had enrolled in college in Austin and had successfully completed her first semester, calling home every Sunday with enthusiastic tales of college life and new friends. The family's debts were paid in full, debt collectors stopped calling, and letters with threatening red stamps no longer appeared in the mailbox. For the first time in years, Marge and John were able to afford minor repairs to their old house. A new water heater to replace the leaky one, fresh paint for the living room walls that hadn't been painted since the 90s, and even a new couch to replace the sagging one with the springs sticking out. On Christmas Eve, December 22, 2012, John stopped by the local bar where the workers gathered after their shifts. In the corner by the pool table, he spotted Tom Wilson, the owner of the small farm next door and his longtime friend from high school. They hadn't seen each other in months.
John, damn you.
Tom slapped him on the shoulder with such force that the beer almost spilled out of his glass.
Where have you been?
They ordered another beer and sat down at an empty table. The conversation flowed easily about families, jobs, how prices had risen all around them. But then, after the third pint, as the country music grew louder and the voices around them became more boisterous, Tom leaned across the table and asked, lowering his voice,
Listen, John, are you aware of what's going on in your former land right now?
Tom took a sip of beer, leaving foamy trails on his mustache, and continued,
I was coming back from El Paso last week, decided to take a shortcut through these hills. You know where that old dirt road goes? And I passed your old property, and there was a whole procession of heavy equipment, trucks, backhoes, some special machines with oil company logos on them. They blocked the whole road, and I had to wait about 20 minutes for them to let me through. I talked to one of the guards and asked him what was going on. He said it was private property and wouldn't elaborate, but he was wearing a uniform with a Petro West patch. Johnny, this doesn't look like a pasture like Blake told you. They're drilling something, and they're drilling seriously.
At this point, John felt uneasy. He kept quiet, but tossed and turned in bed all night, and in the morning excused himself from work, claiming a headache. As soon as Marge left for school, he got into his Ford F-150 and drove up the familiar road west of town. As he approached the hill overlooking his former property, John noticed unusual activity from a distance. He pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and retrieved from the glove compartment an old pair of binoculars he had taken on a rare hunting trip. What he saw made him pale and wipe his eyes as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. In an area he'd known all his life as a barren patch of desert, a 90-foot drilling rig emblazoned with Horizon Drilling stood tall. Dozens of workers in helmets and safety vests, equipment trucks and concrete mixers bustled about. Not far from the main rig stood a makeshift office, a modular building emblazoned with the logo of Texas Prime Properties and a larger version of Western Texas Petroleum. This wasn't just exploration, this was full-scale oil development. John came home shaken, with a pale face and trembling hands. When Marge came home from school, she knew immediately that something was wrong. Her husband was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into space, an untouched cup of long cold coffee in front of him. He silently showed her the pictures he'd taken on his cell phone from the hill. The blurry images clearly showed a drilling rig and oil company logos.
Oh my God, John. That's...
Marge couldn't finish the sentence and slowly sank into the chair next to her husband. They couldn't sleep that night. They lay in the dark, going over the possibilities in their heads, analyzing every word Blake had said during their meetings.
Richard knew.
John repeated, looking up at the ceiling.
He knew it all from the beginning. He knew the oil was there. That's why he was in such a hurry to sell. That's why he offered so much for this barren land.
Before dawn, Marge got up and turned on the nightlight.
We need a lawyer, John. A good lawyer. What Blake has done is fraud. He deliberately withheld information about the value of the land.
The next day, they called several law firms in Pecos and neighboring towns, but most refused to take a case against Texas Prime Properties. The company had too much influence in the area. Finally, on the advice of a colleague, Marge, they contacted David Morgan, a young attorney who had recently opened a practice in Midland. Morgan, a graduate of the University of Texas School of Law, had not yet developed connections and obligations with local power brokers and agreed to take their case for a minimal fee of $3,000 up front and a percentage of any potential compensation. Morgan went to work with the energy and enthusiasm often found in young lawyers, not yet disillusioned with the justice system. He formally requested geological reports from the Texas Railroad Commission, which, despite the name, regulates the state's oil and gas industry. At the same time, he scrutinized every record of land transactions in the county for the past 2 years, checked drilling permits, and examined the corporate connections of Texas Prime Properties. For 2 weeks, the Carters lived on pins and needles. Marge stopped sleeping at night, furtively taking sedatives. John became absent-minded, making mistakes in his work. One Friday, when they had almost given up hope, John's phone rang right in the middle of the workday. It was Morgan calling, and his normally calm voice sounded agitated.
Mr. Carter, come to my office today, preferably with your wife. There's news. Important news.
They rushed to Midland immediately after work, traveling 80 miles in a record hour and a bit. Morgan's office was in a modest business center on the outskirts of town. 2 small rooms with minimalist furniture and stacks of legal documents. The young lawyer, with disheveled hair and loosened tie, clearly hadn't slept well the last few days. He looked like a man who had uncovered a conspiracy.
Look.
Morgan spread some documents with official seals and colorful maps of the area on the table.
I had to use old connections at the university and even paid a clerk at the archives, but it was worth it. Here's what I found. 3 months before the deal with you, the 14th of January, 2012 to be exact, Blake's company commissioned a private geological survey of your site from the firm Geotex Analytics. The survey was conducted in secret, using the latest seismic technology that does not require physical presence on the site.
Morgan turned the page of the report, and the Carters saw a colored diagram with red and orange spots.
This is a map of potential deposits. The results show a high probability of oil deposits, over 85%, at a depth of about 2,000 feet. Preliminary estimates of the deposit could be between 1 and 3 million barrels of light oil. Roughly speaking, at today's prices, that's between $80 million and $240 million in retail value. Even including production costs, that's a colossal amount of money.
Morgan leaned back in his chair, his eyes glittering with a mixture of anger and determination.
He knew about the oil before he ever came to your shop, John,
he said, tapping his finger on the red-spotted map.
It's not just a coincidence or a lucky investment. Blake deliberately withheld the results of the study. Texas law requires the seller to disclose all known information that materially affects the value of the property. He deceived you, knowing there were millions of dollars under the land, and slipped you a measly $50,000 as a handout.
The lawyer's words hung in the air, heavy and sharp as a hot Texas wind. Marge squeezed John's hand under the table, her fingers trembling with the realization of betrayal. Morgan continued,
We have every opportunity to sue for fraud and demand that the deal be rescinded. We can get the land back, or at least compensation that reflects its true value.
John nodded, his face petrified with suppressed rage, and a spark of hope, faint but alive, flickered in his chest. Marge exhaled.
Do it, David. We want justice.
The Carters left Morgan's office with a feeling they hadn't felt in months, a belief that truth could triumph over Richard Blake's lies and money. Richard Blake, however, was not a man to back down easily. He was used to being in control, and the Carters' lawsuit was not just a threat to him, but a personal challenge. Exactly 1 week after Morgan filed the papers in circuit court, John's phone rang in the middle of dinner. An unfamiliar number with a Houston area code appeared on the screen. John frowned, wiped his hands on his napkin, and reluctantly answered.
Hi, John.
Came Blake's voice, smooth as oil and cold as the steel of an oil rig.
It's been a while since we spoke. I think you should drop this lawsuit. Trust me, it's in your best interest.
There was no urgency in his tone. It was confident and calm, like a predator stalking its prey. That tone sent a shiver down John's spine. He remained silent, and Blake continued, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper.
I know about your tractor debt to Jackson, 2005. $20,000 you took from the old man and never paid back. Remember when he died in 2008 and you thought the debt died with him? You didn't list that amount when you took out a mortgage on a new house in 2010, did you? That's fraudulent financial reporting, John. In Texas, you can get up to 5 years in prison for that, and I'm going to make sure you go to trial.
John froze, his fork hanging in the air with an unfinished piece of mashed potato. His heart was pounding so loudly that he could barely hear Marge ask,
Who's that?
Blake finished with a slight chuckle.
Think of your family, John. Drop the lawsuit and we'll forget this little misunderstanding.
The line went dead, leaving Carter in an oppressive silence where every sound, the ticking of a clock, the creaking of a chair, seemed louder than the thunder. John turned pale as the blood rushed from his face at once. He swallowed convulsively, feeling a lump sticking in his throat. In 2005, he'd actually borrowed $20,000 from an old neighbor, Bill Jackson, for a used John Deere tractor, a rusty wreck that had barely survived a couple of seasons. Jackson, a grumpy widower from a farm 5 miles from the Carters' home, agreed to a handwritten receipt with no interest, just to help out. But in 2008, the old man died of a heart attack. His children sold the farm and moved out of Pecos, and the receipt paper got lost somewhere in the chaos of the move. John, gritting his teeth, figured the debt had faded into oblivion. No one demanded the money, no one remembered. Until now.
How do you know?
He squeezed out, voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. Blake on the other end of the wire let out a short, dry chuckle as if the bolt of a gun had clicked.
I've got eyes and ears everywhere, John. In the banks, in the courts, in the IRS. People who see everything from your old debts to what you had for breakfast. Drop the suit or I'll crush you. Your family loses their home, your kids lose their future, and you rot behind bars. It's your choice.
The line went silent, leaving John in a daze, with the phone receiver in his shaking hand. An hour later, he was sitting in the living room with Marge, recounting the conversation word for word as she nervously rubbed the edge of the tablecloth. They had called Morgan, and the lawyer had rushed to their house despite the late hour. After listening to John, Morgan frowned, his lean face tense.
This is serious. Threats? Blackmail? He's clearly panicking for going to this length. But listen to me. This is further proof of his foul play. Blake is trying to break you because he knows the truth is on our side.
Morgan clenched his fist, looking them in the eye.
We're not giving up. Let him throw his dirty tricks. We'll use them against him.
In March 2013, as the Texas sun was beginning to scorch as hot as a frying pan, the Carters' case against Richard Blake finally reached the district court in Pecos. After months of preparation, sleepless nights, and endless trips to Midland to see Morgan, this day seemed crucial. David Morgan, with his neatly trimmed beard and a stack of files under his arm, was full of confidence.
We have ironclad evidence,
He told the Carters the day before the hearing, spreading out on a table geologic reports and Blake's secret contracts with Geotex Analytics.
Withholding information about the oil is a direct violation of the law. The judge is bound to side with us.
John and Marge, sitting in his cramped office, nodded, clinging to every word like a lifeline. But on the morning of March 14th, as they entered the old Reeves County Courthouse, a red brick building with cracked wooden benches and the smell of dust, their confidence cracked. Behind the judge's podium sat Harry Peterson, a heavy-set man with bushy gray eyebrows and a look that could burn a hole in a wall. His name gave John a vague unease, but he didn't immediately understand why. Morgan, glancing at the referee, clenched his teeth imperceptibly. Only later, during a break, did one of the clerks whisper something to the lawyer that turned the tables. Peterson and Blake were old buddies. They had gone to Texas A&M together in the 80s, shared a dorm room, and for the past decade had met regularly on the golf course. When Blake entered the lounge in an immaculate gray suit, he exchanged a barely perceptible nod with Peterson, a gesture that didn't escape Marge's eyes. Her heart clenched.
John, this isn't a trial. It's their game.
The meeting turned out to be a farce, stretching for only 50 agonizing minutes. Morgan, determined, stood up with a stack of documents and began to lay out the case, the secret geological survey, the fudged timeline, Blake's clear violation of the disclosure law. But Judge Peterson, seated behind his podium, seemed like a man who had passed judgment in advance. He He interrupted Morgan at every turn, his bushy eyebrows frowning and his voice rattling like thunderclaps over the plains. When the lawyer tried to present the Geotex Analytics report, Peterson brushed it aside, calling it speculative and unconvincing. Deposit maps, clerk testimony, even circumstantial evidence of the urgency of the deal, all were dismissed with contempt. Finally, Peterson announced the judgment, looking over his glasses.
The plaintiffs, John and Marge Carter, failed to exercise due diligence in entering into the transaction. No evidence of willful deception on the part of the defendant has been presented. The case is dismissed in favor of Richard Blake and Texas Prime Properties.
His gavel struck the table with such force that it echoed around the room, drowning out Marge's quiet sob. Blake rose from his seat, his face spread into a smug smile. He walked to the podium and shook Peterson's hand. Not just a formal gesture, but a firm, friendly handshake with a pat on the shoulder. The Carters sat as if thunderstruck, their world crumbling right on those creaky pews. John stared at the floor, clenching his fists, and Marge covered her face with her hands to hide her tears. As they walked out of the courthouse into the blazing sun, Morgan, walking beside them, looked as if he had aged 10 years.
We lost before we even entered this courtroom,
He muttered, tossing the file folder into his briefcase.
This isn't justice. This is their private club.
There was desperation in his voice, mixed with the bitter truth they all now realized. But that defeat in court proved to be only the beginning of the real nightmare. 2 weeks later, on the night of March 29th, the Carters were jolted out of their sleep by the furious barking of their old dog, Rusty. John, still reeling from the disturbing dream, jumped out of bed, smelling a strange odor of smoke. Barefoot, in his pajamas, he rushed to the bedroom window and froze. Their barn, 20 yards away, was engulfed in roaring orange flames. Tongues of fire were devouring the wooden walls, throwing sparks into the night sky, and thick black smoke drifted over the yard like an ominous fog. Marge, pulling on a robe, was already calling 911, her voice shaking with panic. The Pecos Volunteer Fire Department arrived 15 minutes later, their sirens breaking the silence of the sleeping town. But it was too late. The barn John's father had built had collapsed into a pile of smoldering embers as they hosed it down. In the morning, raking through the charred remains, John realized the extent of the loss. The shed held his entire working arsenal, a toolbox, a welder, an old generator, everything that allowed him to pick up part-time jobs repairing equipment and keeping his family afloat. Without it, he was like he had no hands. The official report from the fire department read, probable cause, short circuit in old wiring. But John, standing amidst the ashes with a shovel in his hands, didn't believe a word of it. He remembered Blake's threats, his cold voice in the telephone receiver, his words about the family losing everything.
This isn't an accident, Marge.
He told his wife, his eyes red with smoke and anger.
It's Blake. He sent us a warning.
She was silent as she stared at the smoking ruins, but the same fear that plagued him was in her gaze. Less than a week after the fire, the local press poured salt on the Carters' wounds. The Saturday edition of the Pecos Enterprise, the main newspaper in Reeves County, carried an article with the catchy headline, West Texas Oil Boom, Texas Prime Properties Hits the Bullseye. The reporter described how the first well on the property recently acquired by Blake's company was producing 300 barrels of light crude per day, an amount considered a gold mine in the state's oil circles. Experts interviewed by the newspaper agreed that at that rate, and given the depth of the deposits, the value of the oil underground could be worth at least $2 million and more with luck. The article included a photo of Richard Blake standing in front of the derrick in an expensive jacket and cowboy hat, arms crossed over his chest with a winning smile. In interviews, he raved about his entrepreneurial flair and ability to see opportunity where others see desolation. It's hard work and a belief in the potential of Texas. The newspaper quoted him as boasting about plans to expand production. John bought a copy at the gas station newsstand and brought it home, tossing the paper on the kitchen table in front of Marge. They read in silence, and each word was like a stinging blow. The land they'd sold for a measly $50,000 was now making Blake millions, and he was making himself look like a genius by stealing their future and wrapping it in a beautiful success story. Blow after blow shattered the Carter family. Emma, their brightest hope, dropped out of Austin College just a year after enrolling. Her dreams of graduation and a career, for which she had crammed her textbooks until midnight, crumbled under the weight of new realities.
I can't watch you break your backs for me,
she told her parents, returning home with a suitcase and tears in her eyes. The family was now watching every dollar. Without the barn and tools, income had plummeted and bills were only growing. Emma took a job as a waitress at a local diner to help out in some way. Marge, whose resilience had always held the family together, began to fade. Night after night, she lay sleepless, staring at the ceiling as shadows from streetlights crept across the walls. The insomnia turned into depression. She began to forget the lessons she had prepared for her students, and one day she cried at a school assembly. The doctor prescribed antidepressants, but they only dulled the pain, not eliminated it. John took a second job to make ends meet. Night shifts at a warehouse in Midland, an hour's drive from home. He would return home at dawn, hunched over and silent, the smell of machine oil on his clothes. One night, sitting at the table over a bowl of cold soup, Marge looked at John with empty eyes and whispered,
"We didn't just lose money, John. We lost our future. Everything we've lived for has been stolen right out from under us."
Her words hung in the air, heavy and true as the Texas heat. David Morgan, despite losing in court, wasn't about to give up. He spent weeks researching federal laws and found a new way. He filed a complaint with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. In his filing, he alleged that Blake, as head of Texas Prime Properties, had violated federal disclosure regulations by defrauding the Carters and using insider information for personal gain. It was a long shot, but Morgan believed the SEC could hold Blake accountable where a local court was powerless. In April 2014, the commission launched an investigation, requesting mountains of documents from the company, from geological reports to financial entries. The Carters waited for news, clinging to a faint hope as the months dragged on in grueling obscurity. Finally, on a cold December day in 2014, the phone rang. An SEC spokesperson, a dry voice with a Washington accent, reported,
"We have completed our review. Yes, we found violations. Blake and his company willfully withheld data on the value of the site, which falls under federal fraud. There is evidence of manipulation."
John and Marge looked at each other, hearts beating faster, but the man continued,
"However, the most we can do is impose a fine on Texas Prime Properties. Probably a few $100,000 if we're lucky. It's almost impossible to get the land back to you or get full compensation. They have two good lawyers and the deal's already been finalized."
The voice in the receiver fell silent, and with it the last spark of hope faded. Morgan, recognizing the outcome, pounded his fist on the desk in his office.
A fine? That's like a mosquito bite to Blake. He stole millions from you and he'll get off with a pittance.
The Carters sat silent, realizing that the system they believed in had slapped them in the face again. By 2015, the rigs on the former Carter land were humming like well-oiled machines, pumping oil day and night. According to leaked data from Western Texas Petroleum employees, the wells were producing a steady 300 to 350 barrels a day, and Blake's total profits, according to rumors in Pecos oil circles, topped $1.8 million net, and that was just the first year. The money flowed. Blake bought a luxurious mansion in Houston's prestigious River Oaks neighborhood, complete with swimming pool and marble floors, and then added to his collection a mansion on the Florida coast in Palm Beach, where Texas oil tycoons vacationed. It was whispered in local bars that he drove around in a brand new Bentley and bragged to friends that he had made a fortune on fools, and the Carters stayed in the same old house on the outskirts of Pecos, with chipped paint on the walls and a creaking porch that John never had time to fix after the fire. Their lives had become an endless fight for justice that slipped through their fingers like sand. Gritting his teeth, Morgan appealed to a higher court in Austin, hoping to overturn Peterson's decision. But the process dragged on. Blake had an army of expensive Houston lawyers, each costing more than the Carters had made in a year. Blake's connections, from judges to oil department officials, tangled the case like barbed wire, and the appeal crawled along at a snail's pace, leaving the Carters suspended between hope and despair. The story of John and Marge Carter is not just the story of the millions that slipped through the hands of an ordinary Texas family. It is a dark saga of a system where the rich and powerful rewrite the rules to suit themselves and leave ordinary people in the dust. It's a story of how one signature, delivered in a moment of desperation, can crush dreams, destroy futures, and turn life into a never-ending struggle. But the Carters did not give up. Their cause became a beacon for others. Dozens of West Texas farmers and landowners whose land had also been wiped out by fraud joined the fight. Local activists launched the Justice for the Pecos movement, collecting signatures and demanding that authorities investigate such schemes. Morgan, exhausted but stubborn, keeps digging, hoping to find a loophole that will turn the tide. And yet the finale remains open. One day, standing outside his house watching the sun set over the plains, John said to Marge,
If we can't get our money back, at least we can get our dignity back.
Friends, write in the comments what you think of this story. We value your opinion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many more interesting stories to come. Thanks for watching.